The esoteric and the occult are important for believers to be aware of, but they have a long, confusing, and storied history, and most people nowadays are not aware of the interconnectedness of these various occult and esoteric traditions within Western esotericism and how those things are linked, and how the practices have much in common, and how they might be related to things like the New Age that you hear about. This leads to a lot of confusion in the Christian church and people not knowing how to engage with things, not knowing how to know if something is, say, demonic or anti-Christian or part of another religion that they shouldn't be practicing, and it can lead to all kinds of questions. So I think it's beneficial to take a look at the history of these things so that people can have a greater understanding of them and see how they're all connected and how all the pieces of the puzzle and history fit together, and how these ideas have their roots in ancient mythological systems that bring them to the forefront of modern culture. The reality is that early Christians had opinions on these type of things. They had opinions on the history of world mythologies. They had opinions on practicing things like magic and rituals. They had opinions on all of these things, and they were well aware of them in the ancient world, and we've lost much of that to our modern day knowledge, and it's valuable to me to recover that. If it sounds interesting to you as well, then I encourage you to consider sticking around with the channel. I appreciate your support, your time. I would appreciate if you consider leaving a like, commenting, or following along with the channel, and leaving me any suggestions that you may have. This is Credence Questions, and I thank you for watching. So what really is Esoterica? Well, you have to understand these terms that I'm kind of conflating here mean a lot of things and have lots of history behind them, but the general meaning of the word esoteric just means inner circle. So you have this idea of kind of like a secret inner meeting type of word there, whereas the word occult simply means hidden. Think of the word like occlusion. This is just something being hidden. So we have hidden things behind barriers or hidden in the inner circle, and that's sort of the relationship between the occult idea and the esoteric idea. Some disciplines that you might know or might consider occult or may have not, but are kind of grouped into this category include things like alchemy, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, magic, mythology, mysticism, astrology, Kabbalah, occultism, and Freemasonry. All of these things kind of fit into these categories, but people aren't always sure exactly how. I'm going to walk you through just a little bit of that today. These disciplines are also definitively different in many ways, but they're also very closely linked and can be found to historically proceed from one another, which is kind of my main point. The basic ideas that they all have in common are kind of these standard metaphysical ideas. Anton Favre, who is a prominent French scholar of Western esotericism, lists these following standard 6 commonalities. Number 1 is correspondences, which is a metaphysical link between all things in the cosmos, such as the link between silver and the moon that you hear a lot about in things like alchemy. The second idea is living nature, the idea that this cosmos that we're talking about is alive and matter is not inert. It's more of something like energy that you might hear. Third is the idea of imagination and mediations, in that imagination is essentially a type of organ that perceives hidden reality beyond what is physical. Number 4 is transmutation, not just intellectual transmutation, but actual inner transformation mystically or spiritually, that you can innerly transform yourself into something different, a different spiritual or cosmic thing, literally. Number 5 is concordance. The practices are all unified by a universal truth. So they have concordance with one another. They're all seeking after the same truth. For example, Kabbalah, astrology, and tarot being pushed together and practiced in the same groups. And then finally, number 6 is transmission, which is where they believe that these truths can only be passed on by specific relationships or specific societies. That's that inner circle idea, for example, the degrees of Freemasonry. So where do these ideas come from? How far back can we trace things like magic, divination, alchemy, astrology, and such practices? Let's look first at ancient Mesopotamia. Ancient Mesopotamia is essentially the oldest culture and civilization that we're aware of, coupled with maybe ancient Egypt. Both of them are older than 3000 BC. Mesopotamia essentially becomes what we know as Babylon from the Bible and has much crossover with Canaanite myths and practices. In ancient Mesopotamia, magic was invoked in many kinds of rituals and medical formulae to counteract evil omens. Defensive or legitimate magic in Mesopotamia were incantations and ritual practices intended to alter specific realities. The ancient Mesopotamians also believed that magic was the only viable defense against demons, ghosts, and evil sorcerers. If you look into Babylonian or Mesopotamian astronomy, we can see that from Sumerian times, temple priesthoods had attempted to associate current events with certain positions of the planets and stars. This continued to Assyrian times when limulists were created as a year-by-year association of events with planetary positions, which, when they have survived to the present day, allow accurate associations of relative with absolute dating for establishing the history of Mesopotamia. Babylonian astronomers were adept with mathematics and could predict things like eclipses and solstices, and their scholars thought everything had some kind of purpose in astronomy, most of these related to religions and omens. Mesopotamian astronomers worked out of a 12-month calendar based on the cycles of the moon. They divided the year into 2 seasons, summer and winter. The origins of astronomy as well as astrology date from this time. During the 8th and 7th centuries BC, Babylonian astronomers developed a new approach to astronomy. They began studying philosophy dealing with the ideal nature of the early universe and began employing an internal logic with their predictive planetary systems. This was an important contribution to astronomy and the philosophy of science, and some scholars have thus referred to this new approach as the first scientific revolution. This new approach to astronomy was further developed in Greek and Hellenistic astronomy. Babylonian astronomy then served as the basis for much of Greek, Classical Indian, Sasanian, Byzantine, Syrian, medieval Islamic, Central Asian, and Western European astronomy, which is really important. So now let's take a look at Egypt, as we said, which is the second oldest, debatably, society, may have existed around the same time. In ancient Egypt, magic was personified as the god Heka and was an integral part of religion and culture, which is known to us through a substantial corpus of texts which are products of the Egyptian tradition. While the category magic has been contentious for modern Egyptology, there is clear support for its applicability from ancient terminology. The Coptic term Hik is the descendant of the Pharaonic term Heka, which, unlike its Coptic counterpart, had no connotation of impiety or illegality, and is attested from the Old Kingdom through to the Roman era. The instructions for Marikare informs us that Heka was gifted by the creator to humanity in order to be weapons to ward off the blow of events. Magic was practiced by both a literate priestly hierarchy and by illiterate farmers and herdsmen. The main principle of Heka is centered on the power of words to bring things into being. You might recognize that as a modern concept, something like manifestation, or even tying it back further into how God speaks the universe into existence in Genesis 1. You might have heard of something like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which contains a number of spells. The Book of the Dead is made up of a number of individual texts and their accompanying illustrations. Most subtexts begin with the word ro, which can mean mouth, speech, spell, utterance, incantation, or chapter of a book. In the context of the Book of the Dead, it is typically translated as either chapter or spell. So you have the idea of magic, incantation, spells, astrology, all of this in ancient Egypt very definitively, and in ancient Mesopotamia as well. Now let's turn to the Jewish world and how they pick up on these things. Jewish religious law forbids divination and other forms of things like soothsaying. The Talmud lists many persistent and condemned divining practices. If you talk about something like practical Kabbalah in historical Judaism, it's a branch of the Jewish mystical tradition that concerns the use of magic. It was considered permitted white magic by its practitioners, reserved for the elite who could separate its spiritual source from realms of evil if performed under circumstances that were holy. The concern of overstepping Judaism's strong prohibitions of impure magic ensured that it remained a minor tradition in Jewish history. Its teachings include the use of divine and angelic names for amulets and incantations. These magical practices of Judaic folk religion became part of practical Kabbalah later on. And finally, if we bring magic into the Greco-Roman world, we see that the English word magic literally has its origins in ancient Greece. During the late 6th and early 5th centuries BCE, the Persian magus was Grecicized and introduced into the Greek language as magos and mageia. In doing so, it transformed meaning, gaining negative connotations, with the magos being regarded as a charlatan whose ritual practices were fraudulent, strange, unconventional, and dangerous, so different than standard pagan worship, for example. Magic was not distinct from a religion, but rather an unwelcome, improper expression of it, the religion of the other. Practicing magic was a form of insult to the ancient Greeks. Further, in ancient Roman society, magic was associated with societies to the east of the empire. The 1st century CE writer Pliny the Elder, for instance, claimed that magic had been created by the Iranian philosopher Zoroaster, from which you might recognize Zoroastrianism, and that it had been brought into the West by the magician Osthanes, who accompanied the military campaigns of the Persian king Xerxes. Ancient Greek scholarship of the 20th century, almost certainly influenced by Christianizing preconceptions of the meanings of magic and religion, and the wish to establish Greek culture as the foundation of Western rationality, developed a theory of ancient Greek magic that was primitive and insignificant, and thereby essentially separate from Homeric religion. Since the last decade of the century, however, recognizing the ubiquity and respectability of acts such as binding spells, described as magic by modern and ancient observers alike, scholars have been compelled to abandon this viewpoint. The Greek word for magic itself derives from the word magos, originally simply the Greek name for a Persian tribe known for practicing their religion. This is interesting because similarly to in my Labubu video, I mentioned a lot of things originating from Persian culture relating to things like magic and rituals and handed down practices and the origins of Celtic mythology and other things like that being traced back to Persian mythology. And here we can see literally the idea of magic stemming from a Persian tribe known for their practices. You can see this early idea of the Christianized perspective of magic in writers like Augustine of Hippo, who thought that magic did not merely constitute fraudulent and unsanctioned ritual practices, but was the very opposite of religion because it relied upon a cooperation from demons. In this, Christian ideas of magic were closely linked to the Christian category of paganism, and both magic and paganism were regarded as belonging under the broader category of superstition, another term borrowed from pre-Christian Roman culture. The Christian emphasis on the immorality and wrongness of magic conflicts a bit with the other approaches from monotheistic religions like Judaism and Islam. For example, while Christians regarded demons as inherently evil, there are entities such as the jinn in Islamic mythology that were perceived more as just ambivalent. We made mention of divination and the prohibited practices in the Jewish religion section, and you can see kind of the procession from magic to divination if we look closely. The model of the magician in Christian thought was provided by Simon Magus, Simon the Magician, who was a figure who opposed St. Peter in the Acts of the Apostles and also the apocryphal Acts of Peter. Christian theologians believe that there were multiple different forms of magic, the majority of which were types of divination. Divination is the attempt to gain insight into a question or situation by way of an occultic ritual or practice. Using various methods throughout history, diviners ascertain their interpretations of how a questioner should proceed by reading signs, events, or omens, or through alleged contact or interaction with supernatural agencies, such as spirits, gods, or other beings. Going back to Augustine once again, in his work on the divination of demons, he affirms that most of the time, demons simply predict what they will do in the future. However, they also possess a divinatory power, essentially deriving from the greater acuity of the senses of their aerial bodies and the experience accumulated during their long lives. This allows them to interpret divine signs of the times in the natural world that humans are unable to grasp and foretell future events, even those that are not immediate. Further, they can cause illnesses and fantastic visions in people both in a sleeping and waking state. The accuracy of the predictions clashes with their evil and deceptive nature, and with God's higher plans that are only known to him, and his angels can even divert and override the signs caught by demons in the natural world. So that's just early Christianity extrapolating on how they think demons can make use of supernatural powers and things like divination and different types of rituals and magic, and how they can have some predictive accuracy but not full predictive accuracy. As we alluded to, the practice of magic and divination are prohibited in Jewish law, looking back to Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. You can see some of the laws here, such as in Exodus 22, you shall not tolerate a sorceress. Leviticus 20, a man or woman who has a ghost or a familiar spirit shall be put to death. Deuteronomy 18, let no one be found among you who consigns a son or daughter to the fire, or who is an augur, a soothsayer, a diviner, a sorcerer, one who casts spells, or one who consults ghosts or familiar spirits, or one who inquires of the dead. You can see magic, sorcery, spells, divination, and even necromancy mentioned in that passage. That might make you think of some of the instances in biblical narrative where we see explicitly magic being practiced, such as Simon Magus that we mentioned, but also, for example, in the book of Exodus, the Egyptian magicians who replicate the signs in front of Pharaoh done by Moses and Aaron, and perhaps more explicitly in 1 Samuel 28, when Saul goes to the witch of Endor and summons the spirit of the deceased prophet Samuel, who rebukes him for using witchcraft. Surprisingly, and despite these prohibitions in Jewish law, there was a practice of Jewish magic in the late Second Temple period, at least, and it's well documented into the periods of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. Jewish and Samaritan magicians appear in the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles, and also in the works of Josephus. A lot of the information that we have about Jewish magic comes from the Jewish magical papyri, which are a subclass of papyri with specific Jewish magical uses, and which shed light on the popular belief during the late Second Temple period and after in late antiquity. There's some other evidence we have of Jewish magical practices, including inscriptions on things like amulets and incantation bowls. This practice of Jewish mysticism and Jewish magic leads into what we know as Kabbalah. Kabbalah is an esoteric method, a discipline, and a school of thought in Jewish mysticism. It forms the foundation of mystical religious interpretations within Judaism. There's some differentiation within Kabbalah, such as practical Kabbalah, which in historical Judaism is a branch of this mysticism that concerns the use of magic. It was considered permitted white magic by its practitioners, reserved for the elite, who could separate its spiritual source from the realms of evil if performed under holy circumstances. The concern of overstepping Judaism's prohibitions against impure magic ensured that it remained a very minor tradition in Jewish history. Its teachings include the use of divine and angelic names for amulets and incantations. According to Gershom Scholem, many of the teachings of practical Kabbalah predate and are independent of theoretical Kabbalah, which is what we probably associate with the term today. Historically speaking, a large part of the contents of practical Kabbalah predate those of the speculative Kabbalah and are not dependent on them. In effect, what came to be considered practical Kabbalah constituted an agglomeration of all the magical practices that had developed in Judaism from the Talmudic period down through the Middle Ages. Then it isn't until the medieval period that we really see the formalization of Kabbalah, particularly in southern France and Spain. Foundational texts such as the Bahir and especially the Zohar were composed during this time, laying the groundwork for later developments. The Kabbalistic teachings of this era delve deeply into the nature of the divine, the structure of the universe, and the process of creation. Notable Kabbalists like Moses de Leon played crucial roles in disseminating these teachings, which were categorized by their profound symbolic and allegorical interpretations of the Torah. From the Renaissance onwards, Jewish Kabbalah texts entered non-Jewish culture, where they were studied and translated by Christian Hebraists and Hermetic occultists. The syncretic traditions of Christian Kabbalah and Hermetic Kabbalah developed independently of Judaic Kabbalah, reading the Jewish texts as a universalist ancient wisdom preserved from the Gnostic traditions of antiquity. There's a lot of interconnectedness you can notice there. Both adapted the Jewish concepts freely from their Jewish understanding to merge with multiple other theologies, religious traditions, and magical associations. With the decline of Christian Kabbalah in the Age of Reason, Hermetic Kabbalah continued as a central underground tradition in Western esotericism. Through these non-Jewish associations with magic, alchemy, and divination, Kabbalah acquired some popular occult connotations forbidden within Judaism, where Jewish practical Kabbalah was a minor, permitted tradition restricted for a few elite. Today, many publications on Kabbalah belong to the non-Jewish New Age and occult traditions of Kabbalah, rather than giving an accurate picture of historic Judaic Kabbalah. You might have noticed the mention there of Hermeticism and Hermetic Kabbalah, which is especially interesting to the Western esoteric traditions, and has interesting implications on the Western traditions of things like alchemy. Hermetic Kabbalah is a Western esoteric tradition involving mysticism and the occult. It is the underlying philosophy and framework for magical societies such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which will be really important later, as well as esoteric Christian organizations like the Rose Cross Society, the Thelemic Orders, the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross, and more, which are all going to be very important. Hermetic Kabbalah arose from Christian Kabbalah, which was itself derived from Jewish Kabbalah during the European Renaissance, becoming variously esoteric Christian, non-Christian, or anti-Christian across its different schools in the modern era. It draws on a great many influences, most notably Jewish Kabbalah, Western astrology, alchemy, pagan religions, especially Egyptian and Greco-Roman, Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, and the symbols of the tarot. Hermetic Kabbalah differs from the Jewish form in being a more syncretic system. However, it shares many concepts with Jewish Kabbalah. Some of those key terms that we pointed out there are things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is a type of Freemasonry that's practiced still in lodges to this day, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail there as well. And Thelema is the famous occult practice developed by Aleister Crowley. Now I want to take a look at some of the specific views within Kabbalah and some of the most important foundational structures. One of those, and perhaps the most glaring, is the Tree of Life. The Tree of Life is a diagram used in Kabbalah and other mystical traditions derived from it. It usually is referred to as the Kabbalistic Tree of Life to distinguish it from things like the Tree of Life that appears in the Genesis narrative. Here's an image of what the Tree of Life in Kabbalah looks like. These 10 tiers represent both the human body and a spiritual world. You can see the structures there of each tier being named: crown, wisdom, intelligence, mercy, judgment, beauty, lasting endurance, majesty, foundation of the world, and kingdom. The diagram is also used in Christian Kabbalah, Hermetic Kabbalah, and Theosophy, which is another important one. The nodes are associated with deities, angels, celestial bodies, moral values, single colors or combinations of them, and specific numbers. In the modern day, Kabbalah crosses right over to Eastern and New Age practices, as you can see here with the Tree of Life being associated with the chakras. So this is a long line of inspiration that we can track back, practices overlapping each other. Perhaps one of the most influential that was mentioned is that of alchemy. Alchemy is an ancient branch of natural philosophy, a philosophical and proto-scientific tradition that was historically practiced in China, India, and the Muslim world, and in Europe. In its Western form, alchemy is first attested in a number of pseudepigraphical texts written in Greco-Roman Egypt during the first few centuries AD. Greek-speaking alchemists often refer to their craft as the art, or knowledge, which you might recognize as something like gnosis or Gnosticism, and it was often characterized as mystic, sacred, or divine. Alchemists attempted to purify, mature, and perfect certain materials. Common aims were chrysopia, the transmutation of base metals into noble metals, particularly gold, which is what you might think of when you hear alchemy, the creation of the elixir of immortality, or the sorcerer's stone, and the creation of panaceas to be able to cure any disease. The perfection of the human body and soul was thought to result from the alchemical magnum opus, or the great work. The concept of creating the philosopher's stone was variously connected with all of these projects. The start of Western alchemy may be generally traced to ancient and Hellenistic Egypt, where the city of Alexandria was a center of alchemical knowledge and retained its preeminence through most of the Greek and Roman periods. Following the work of André Jean Festugier, modern scholars see alchemical practice in the Roman Empire as originating from the Egyptian goldsmith's art, Greek philosophy, and different religious traditions. Tracing the origins of the alchemical art in Egypt is complicated by the pseudepigraphic nature of the texts from the Greek alchemical corpus. The treatises of Zosimos of Panopolis, the earliest historically attested author, can help in situating the other authors. Zosimos based his work on that of older alchemical authors, such as the ones mentioned here, but very little is known about any of these authors. The most complete of their works, the 4 books of Pseudo-Democritus, were probably written in the 1st century AD. Zosimos relates this back to mythology. He asserted that alchemy dated back to pharaonic Egypt, where it was the domain of the priestly class, though there is little to no evidence for this assertion. Alchemical writers used classical figures from Greek, Roman, and Egyptian mythology to illuminate their works and allegorize alchemical transmutation. These included the pantheon of gods related to the classical planets. The central figure in the mythology of alchemy is Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice great Hermes. His name is derived from the god Thoth and his Greek counterpart Hermes, Thoth being the Egyptian god and Hermes being the Greek god. Hermes and his caduceus, or serpent staff, were among alchemy's principal symbols. According to Clement of Alexandria, he wrote what were called the 42 Books of Hermes, covering all fields of knowledge. If you stumbled into this stuff a bit, you might recognize mentions of things there like Hermes Trismegistus or Thoth, as in the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, which have been getting a lot of attention online. With this knowledge of how alchemy relates to the god Hermes or Thoth, we can go back to that term Hermeticism that we talked about earlier and that's come up so often. Hermeticism is a philosophical and religious tradition rooted in the teachings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, who is a syncretic figure combining the elements of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. This system encompasses a wide range of esoteric knowledge, including aspects of alchemy, astrology, and theurgy, and it has significantly influenced various mystical and occult traditions throughout history. The writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, often referred to as the Hermetica, were produced over a period spanning many centuries, something like 300 BC to 1200 AD, and may be very different in content and scope. In Hermeticism, alchemy, and Kabbalah, which give way to the later developments of things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, we can see the linking ties between Kabbalah, alchemy, occultism, Crowley, and the Masons. To pivot back here to the Egyptian god Thoth being more ancient than Hermes, as I said, you might recognize him from his recent mentions in connection to things like the famous Emerald Tablets. The Emerald Tablet is a compact and cryptic text traditionally attributed to the legendary Hellenistic figure Hermes Trismegistus. The earliest known versions are 4 Arabic recensions preserved in mystical and alchemical treatises between the 8th and 10th centuries CE. Chiefly The Secret of Creation and The Secret of Secrets. It was often accompanied by a frame story about the discovery of an emerald tablet in Hermes' tomb. Beginning from the 1st century BC onwards, Greek texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus appeared in Greco-Roman Egypt. These texts, known as the Hermetica, are a heterogeneous collection of works that in the modern day are commonly subdivided into 2 groups: technical Hermetica, which comprises astrological, medical, botanical, alchemical, and magical writings, and the religio-philosophical Hermetica, which comprises mystical philosophical writings. The Emerald Tablets are once again not to be confused with The Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean, which is a pseudo-historical book written by cult leader Maurice Doreal and first published in the 1940s or 50s, influenced by ancient Egyptian texts and Lovecraft mostly, stories about part reptilian civilizations. It deals with Atlantis, an ancient race of serpent-headed men, alchemy, and a variety of other topics. And this is the one that's talked about by good old Billy Carson. Totally different. For another common term that we've been hearing a lot in all of these things, I want to swing over quickly to astrology, which is a range of divinatory practices that propose that information about human affairs and terrestrial events may be discerned by studying the apparent positions of celestial objects. Different cultures have employed forms of astrology since at least the 2nd millennium BC. These practices have originated in calendrical systems used to predict seasonal shifts and to interpret celestial cycles as signs of divine communications. Prior to the Enlightenment, astrology was generally considered a scholarly tradition and was common in learned circles, and often was practiced in close relation to astronomy, meteorology, medicine, and alchemy. It was present in political circles and is mentioned in various works of literature from Dante to Shakespeare, but during the Enlightenment, astrology lost its status as an area of legitimate scholarly pursuit. To see astrology become largely westernized, we can look to the occupation of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 BC, where Egypt then became Hellenistic. The city of Alexandria was founded by Alexander after the conquest, becoming the place where Babylonian astrology was mixed with Egyptian decanic astrology to create horoscopic astrology as we know it. This contained the Babylonian zodiac with its system of planetary exaltations, the triplicities of the signs, and the importance of eclipses. It used the Egyptian concept of dividing the zodiac into 36 decans of 10 degrees each, with an emphasis on the rising decan, and the Greek system of planetary gods, sign rulership, and the 4 elements. 2nd century BC texts predict positions of planets in zodiac signs at the time of the rising of certain decans, particularly Sothis. The astrologer and astronomer Ptolemy lived in Alexandria. Ptolemy's work, the Tetrabiblos, formed the basis of Western astrology, and enjoyed almost the authority of a Bible among the astrological writers of 1,000 years or more. So I hope you can see the interconnectedness of all of these things in the ancient world. Astrology, alchemy, Hermeticism, the worship of myths and gods who are handing these practices down. I mean, we have this going all the way back to the Egyptian god Thoth, mixing his secret knowledge and magical practice with the Greek god Hermes, and all of that being combined during Hellenistic Egypt with the ancient Babylonian practices of magic and rituals that are probably closer aligned to the things that we hear about in the Old Testament, and all of those being the influence for occult practices like alchemy that lead onto the secret society that we have today. Well, you might want to know exactly how we can trace those things there. So now we can look at the resurfacing of all of these occult practices and ideas during the Middle Ages and into today. We really don't see these ideas start to resurface publicly or in documentation until the 1500s during the Renaissance. Once we get to the early 1600s, we can see the formation of Rosicrucianism, where 3 mysterious documents are discovered featuring Christian Rosicrucians, meaning Rose Cross, who reported having traveled the world and learning secret knowledge. The documents contain many alchemical practices, and little is known about the origins of these documents. But this discovery led to the practice of the fraternities of the Rose Cross, which becomes Rosicrucianism. Rosicrucianism is a spiritual and cultural movement that arose in early modern Europe in the early 17th century after the publication of several texts announcing to the world a new esoteric order. Rosicrucianism is symbolized by the Rose Cross or Rosy Cross. There have been several Rosicrucian organizations since the initial movement was founded, including the Order of the Golden and Rosy Cross, which is exactly what led to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn that we've mentioned so many times. In the 1700s in Scotland, local guilds of stonemasons started social guilds. But eventually, they allow wealthy individuals to begin joining, which transforms it into an elite club with secret information and strange practices, which is where we get Freemasonry, which is obviously still around today in various forms. But some of these Masons then merge with Rosicrucianism in the 1750s, where they form the Order of the Golden and Rosy Cross. These Rosicrucians combine things from alchemy, Kabbalah, and Hermeticism. Notably, King Frederick II of Prussia was a member of the Golden and Rosy Cross Order. It seems to fizzle out somewhat after his death until it's revitalized in England as what we mentioned earlier, the Societas Rosicruciana. From there, this society eventually bleeds into the structure of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which focuses more on ancient paganism. Some notable members of this Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn include William Butler Yeats and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, as well as A.E. Waite and Pixie Smith, who are the creators of the most famous Rider-Waite tarot deck. Later on, in 1767, modeled after both Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry, we get the Ellis Cohens, or the Elect Priests. This organization inspires the Frenchman Papus, who later founds what's called Martinism. Martinism is a form of Christian mysticism and esoteric Christianity concerned with the fall of the first man, his materialistic state of being, deprived of his own divine source, and the process of his eventual return, called reintegration. As a mystical tradition, it was first transmitted through a Masonic high-degree system established around 1740 in France by Martinez de Pasquale, and later propagated in different forms by his 2 students. It's also worth mentioning that LDS and Mormonism seems to take a great deal of inspiration from Masonry and Martinism. Joseph Smith and his preceding presidents are all known to have been Freemasons. Separately, the same ideas influencing the Rose Cross and Masonry and Martinism influenced someone named Emanuel Swedenborg in the early 1700s, which is where we get the creation of something called Swedenborgianism. He popularized ideas of the dead becoming angels or ghosts and remaining on Earth after death, which you might recognize as our view of spirits these days. He was an influence to Joseph Smith, which can be seen in Joseph's visit from the angel Moroni. After Swedenborg's death, his followers founded the New Church in 1787. Around that same time, there was another individual named Franz Mesmer, from whom we get the word mesmerized, because he taught of an invisible force that connected all things and that could be manipulated for healing. Eventually, Franz Mesmer's and Swedenborg's ideas combined to promote the idea of manipulating and communicating with dead spirits, which starts spiritualism as we know it today. Early proponents of spiritualism include people like the Fox sisters in the 1800s, who were perhaps the first modern mediums that we know of, but they were later found out to be frauds. But from Franz Mesmer, we can trace one of his followers named Phineas Quimby, who founded a new movement called New Thought, which primarily taught the idea that one's mental state can have an impact on the real world, which is where we get the origin of manifestation, which, if you Google, looks remarkably similar to the Kabbalistic tree of life that we mentioned earlier. The idea of the manifestation, the New Age, chakras, and the tree of life seem to be very intermingled in thought. If we keep going, the spiritualism movement also influenced someone named Helena Blavatsky, and she was the founder of Theosophy and the Theosophical Society, which came up earlier as well. This society combined Rosicrucianism with spiritualism. One of her primary ideas was root races connected to lost continents like Atlantis, and she taught that Aryans were the most advanced race, teaching Ariosophy. You might be thinking about who that could have inspired, and indeed, this teaching was taken by the Volkisch movement in Germany and led to the foundation of the Thule Society, which is precisely the society from which these guys get their logo. Their logo. So that's a heck of a triple down through all of those influences. If we jump back to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn from the Golden and Rose Cross movement, the most prominent member of the Golden and Rosy Cross is Aleister Crowley, who develops Thelema. Thelema means divine will, and its practice is based around the Book of the Law, which he supposedly received from a spirit that visited him in Egypt in 1909. Thelema focuses more on ceremonial magic, prominently sexual rituals. But Crowley is especially notable because his influence is everywhere. We're going to track some of it today, but it's important to note that people from all over the place were associated with Aleister Crowley, including the founder of NASA and all of the founders of Hollywood. In his later life, he influenced Gerald Gardner, who was the co-founder of Wicca, which we'll talk about in a second. His writings also go on to influence Anton LaVey, who's the founder of the Church of Satan in 1966. Additionally, Crowley also influenced L. Ron Hubbard, who founded Scientology in 1953. Related sort of to Wicca, I want to mention neo-paganism, who are people who revive pagan practices after they had eventually been extinct. Neo-pagans practice things like Druidry, which is the worship and harmony of nature. But of natural and neo-pagan-like practices, Wicca is the most popular. Wicca is predominantly female, though there can also be male witches technically. As I said, it was popularized by Englishman Gerald Gardner in the early 1900s, along with practicing witch Margaret Murray. Gardner was close friends with Aleister Crowley and was involved in his sect of Masonry. Wiccans often practice from Gardner's Book of Shadows, which is conjunctive with Crowley's work. All of these aforementioned ideas, neo-paganism, spirituality, theosophy, New Thought, influence together what we call New Age. So I hope you can see from all of this the interconnectedness of these practices going back ages. These are ancient ritualistic magics practiced in ancient religions and ancient mythologies, traditionally considered to have been handed down by ancient occult practitioners, all the way from Babylon reading the stars, the Egyptians worshipping Thoth, the Greeks pursuing alchemy and secret knowledge, mixing with things like Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Astrology, and magic, and they all come together to create this conglomeration of modern esoterica and occultism. It's not separate, it's not different. What you're practicing is a history that goes back thousands of years. These are things that have been around for the longest time, and I believe that they all have their source in the same place, which is why I think it's important to learn about them. So this has been an incredibly broad overview, and I really hope that you enjoyed. If you did, I hope that you would consider leaving your feedback, sticking around with the channel Creed's Questions. I appreciate your support, your involvement, and I appreciate if you just let me know what you think of all of this. I know this is a lot. There's a lot of information. It's a big, broad overview. There's so much to cover here, which is why it's hard to go over it all, but I really wanted a single video that showed that all of these things are mentioned in the same breath throughout history. They all influence one another, and into the modern day, the practices are all trickled down, and you can trace their influence back to each other. So they aren't separate, they're not different. These are all stemming from the same source. They're all anti-Christian religious practices in some way. So this was one of my favorite videos that I've ever done. I really hope that you enjoyed all of the information. And if you're interested in going deeper into these topics or getting more videos like this, then please let me know. Again, this has been Creed's Questions, and I thank you so much for watching.